This video is going to be a little bit different from my usual format because of two things that have happened. First was a gigantic influx of new subscribers over the past 7 days, mainly due to the interest that was generated by my examination of Douglas Hofstadter's book, Gödel Bach. So hello to everybody who joined. I've been super thrilled with the comments you've all been giving and the great feedback I've been getting about the work I've been doing here, so I hope to keep entertaining and enlightening you for a very long time to come. And the second reason that I'm going to be doing things a little differently today is because I was away over the long weekend, and I was visiting my parents who live in New Jersey, and any visit to New Jersey is an excuse to go to New York City too, and any excuse to go to New York City is an excuse to go to my favorite bookstore in the world, The Strand, on Broadway and 12th Street. And when I was there, I walked out with entirely too many books for my own good, but I have no regrets. And a big part of why I was there was to look for some very specific titles that I knew that I wanted to talk about on this channel at one point or another. So today I'm going to be whipping through the stuff that I picked up, and I'm also going to be giving you a kind of an encapsulated version of how I'm going to try to approach each one of them. So for all the people who just joined, you're going to get basically a crash course in what it is that I do and why I do it. For those of you who haven't read the channel summary, the basic idea here is I talk about science fiction and fantasy mainly by way of things that aren't. The idea being that I look to things outside of science fiction and fantasy and try to figure out how they can be influences on creating science fiction and fantasy. But I will be covering some science fiction and fantasy titles here, but only in a way that I think really deserves to be examined in the light of the channel. So they're going to be few and far between. And one of the ones that did make the list was one of the books that I picked up while I was away, and that is William Gibson's Neuromancer, in this very nice Penguin hardback edition. This was one of a series of 6 20th century science fiction classics that they recently put out. I first read Neuromancer when I was very young. It came out in 1984. It's been 40 years. Can you believe it? And I have to say that when I first read it, I did not really understand a great deal of what was being done and why. And when I talk about the book, I'm not going to focus as much on the future prediction part of it or the cyberpunk part of it so much as I am Gibson's influences, which are surprisingly not what you might think they are. So I'm going to leave that to be unpacked once I have a good way of talking about it. Next up is a book called The Nature of Space and Time. This is a series of lectures given by Stephen Hawking and Roger Penrose. And it is essentially a debate between these two men about the title subject and how they both agree and differ drastically. It's quite technical. Although it's not very long, it's extraordinarily dense. And I spent my time flying back, reading the book very slowly, sometimes rereading pages over and over again a couple of times. But my main interest in the book was not about the actual science, but about the way these two brilliant men were talking about their ideas and defending them and getting into conflicts over their substance and the way that they were being delivered. And I find that sort of thing fascinating, not just the science itself, but the scientists, the people, and the way the people are trying to take their ideas and make them understood and debate those ideas with other people who are at least as much on their level. So that's the kind of ingredient that I like to see in science fiction whenever possible, and that's a big part of why I read it. Next up is a replacement for a number of books that I have had for quite some time, but they have been disintegrating, they've been in bad shape, they've been manhandled, and I decided it makes sense to get them again in really good editions. And I'm talking about 4 of the books by Philip K. Dick, 4 of his best. The Man in the High Castle, The 3 Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? That one is my favorite. And Ubik. And at some point I am also going to be talking about Phil Dick, but again, in the same way that I might talk about Gibson, not necessarily because of the science fiction side of the ideas, but because of the man himself and the way that he was bringing his ideas together. Maybe not so much about the books as such, but again, I'm going to leave that for when I have the exact presentation together properly. Next up is Killers of the Flower Moon by David Grann. You know this book. If you have been paying any attention at all to TV, you know that it was made into a fantastic movie by Martin Scorsese. And the book is, in many ways, even more interesting. And I have a weakness for true stories, not just true crime, but true stories of any deeply researched variety, because the depth of the research and the new world that you're being led into by way of that research, that always feels to me like something to really plunge into and make use of as a source for something in a science fiction or fantasy story. That doesn't mean that we would have to write an SF or fantasy version of this story, but that there are things in it that would, because they are rooted in our world and in our history, make for great sources. Next is a book that I actually used to have and actually read a number of times at one point and then almost completely forgot about. And I'm a little ashamed of that because my memories of it were it being a truly great book. And the book is called The True Believer by Eric Hoffer, Thoughts on the Nature of Mass Movements. And as you can guess from the title, it has renewed significance in the moment in time that we are living through. The book was written in the 1950s, but my cursory re-examination of it on the way home told me that very little, if any of it, has dated in any significant way. And again, this is the kind of thing that I think is worth drawing on if you're going to be doing a story that deals in any way with things like the mass psychology of fascism or authoritarianism. Next up, this is an author whose work I am probably going to end up collecting in toto, but I started with a few key books by them, and one of them is The Mismeasure of Man, and the author is Stephen Jay Gould, a natural scientist who has written wonderfully, and not just with great command of the facts, but also with great language about the natural world. And in this book, he tackles the way the concept of IQ was devised and then abused as a way to oppress people. And the details about how this unfolded are, of course, by themselves fascinating. It's a deeply absorbing story of how science can be misused in the public interest. And again, if you have a story that touches on that subject, this is something you'll want to dive into to derive from. Next up is a work of fiction by an author that I'm not sure many people here are going to know, but let's see what happens. The author is Manuel Puig, and the book is called Kiss of the Spiderwoman. And this is one of my favorite works of fiction, and it was adapted into one of my favorite films by director Hector Bebedco. And the problem is that you can't really see the film very easily right now. It seems to be in some kind of weird rights limbo dispute, something about the distribution of the film. But the novel that it's based on is readily available. This was, I think, a UK edition that I found in the Strand. And I don't know if the story is necessarily going to sound appealing. It is basically a conversation. It's all untold in dialogue between two men who are in prison. One of them is a homosexual window dresser, and the other is a political revolutionary. And the two of them at first would seem to have nothing to do with each other, but the book explores how, in fact, they have a great deal in common, namely that they are both oppressed by a system that cares nothing for what they really want. And then, as they talk, greater and greater complexities unfold between them. Again, this is something where I'm going to have to save a real unpacking of the book for once I've reread it and have some notes to figure out how to connect it back to the main subject. But it's a favorite of mine. I can't not do it. So that is it. Next week, I'm going to be back on track with a video where I will be diving back into one of my usual concerns. So again, if you just joined, you're going to see me a little bit more back in regular action when you rejoin me next week. See you then.